The story of the Battle of Plassey begins not on a battlefield, but in the bustling trading posts of 18th century Bengal. This region, a jewel in the crown of the Mughal Empire, was fabulously wealthy. It was a land of silk and cotton, of spices and unimaginable riches. European powers, particularly the British East India Company, were drawn here like moths to a flame. They weren't conquerors, not yet. They were merchants, operating under agreements with the local ruler, the Nawab of Bengal. For years, a delicate balance was maintained. The company traded, paid its taxes, and the Nawab grew richer from the commerce flowing through his lands. It was a relationship built on mutual, if sometimes tense, benefit and the pursuit of profit. This fragile peace began to crumble in 1756 with the death of Nawab Alivardi Khan. His grandson, a young and fiery man named Siraj-ud-Dowlah, ascended to the throne. Siraj was deeply suspicious of the British. He saw their growing influence not as a commercial partnership, but as a direct threat to his sovereignty. He watched as they expanded their fortifications at Fort William in Calcutta, acting less like traders and more like a rival power. The British, in turn, underestimated the new Nawab. In June 1756, he marched his formidable army on Calcutta to enforce his authority. The British defences were no match for the Nawab's overwhelming force. From their base in Madras, the company's directors knew they had to respond not just to reclaim Calcutta, but to punish the Nawab and secure their future in the richest province of India. The British response was to dispatch a relief force from Madras under the command of one of their most audacious and effective officers, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Clive. The contrast between the two men was stark and went to the very heart of the coming battle. Siraj-ud-Dowlah was a traditional ruler leading a traditional, somewhat unwieldy army. Clive, however, represented a new and far more dangerous kind of power. He led a small, highly disciplined and technologically superior force. Following the recapture of Calcutta by Clive's forces in early 1757, an uneasy truce settled over Bengal. But Clive immediately began to plot, turning to conspiracy. He secretly contacted disgruntled nobles within the Nawab's court, chief among them a powerful general named Mir Jafar. Clive made him an offer he couldn't refuse. Help the British defeat Siraj, and you will be installed as the new Nawab. With this guarantee of betrayal, Clive prepared his small army to march north from Calcutta towards the Nawab's capital, Murshidabad. The British force was a study in compact efficiency. Crucially, Clive also had a small but powerful artillery train of 10 cannons, manned by expert gunners. As they marched, their movements were precise and organized. Siraj-ud-Dowlah, learning of Clive's advance and the brewing conspiracy, gathered his own vast host. His army was a spectacular, almost medieval display of military might. And then there were the war elephants, draped in armor and carrying howdahs for archers or commanders, symbols of the Nawab's power and prestige. The two armies converged on the plains of Plassey, near the banks of the Bhagirathi Hooghly River. On the animated map, you can see the contrast. Clive's tiny column, a thin red line, moves with purpose towards the Lakshbagh mango grove. Siraj's army, a vast, colourful mass, spilled across the landscape in an enormous crescent-shaped encampment. The armies that met at Plassey represented two different worlds of warfare. The Nawab's forces were a magnificent but technologically mixed array of military power. The cavalry were the pride of the army. These horsemen, often from noble families, were skilled riders but fought as individuals rather than a cohesive, disciplined unit. The Nawab's artillery was his greatest potential strength, but also a significant weakness. He possessed over 50 cannons, some of them incredibly large and heavy. But they were difficult to move and took a very long time to reload. The war elephants, while psychologically intimidating, were also a liability in the face of disciplined gunfire. A wounded or panicked elephant could become uncontrollable, turning and trampling its own troops. In stark contrast, Clive's army was a model of modern European military organization. Its backbone was the infantryman armed with the Brown Bess flintlock musket, fitted with a socket bayonet. Clive's artillery was his primary offensive weapon. These brass field guns could be quickly repositioned on the battlefield and used different types of ammunition, from solid round shot to grape shot. The battle began at dawn on the 23rd of June 1757. The monsoon season was underway, and the air was thick with humidity under an overcast sky. Clive had positioned his entire force within the shelter of the large mango grove, using its banks and ditches as a natural defensive barrier. The first shots of the battle were fired by the Nawab's artillery. Around 8 o'clock in the morning, a thunderous roar echoed across the plain as the heavy guns opened up. The British artillery, under Clive's direct orders, returned fire. Their smaller, more mobile cannons were served with greater skill and speed, causing slow but steady casualties. Around mid-morning, a small but daring French contingent supporting the Nawab advanced their lighter cannons to a position much closer to the British grove. Clive was everywhere among his men, personally directing the artillery fire and assessing the situation from the front. He was in complete control of his small responsive force. At around noon, the sky, which had been threatening all morning, finally broke. A torrential monsoon downpour lashed the battlefield. Clive's men were well drilled and well prepared. His gunners immediately covered their cannons and, crucially, their gunpowder supplies with tarpaulins, keeping them dry and ready for action. The Nawab's army was not so fortunate. Their logistics and discipline were far poorer. Most of their gunpowder was left exposed to the elements. When the storm passed, the Nawab's mighty artillery train had been effectively silenced. Believing that the British cannons must have suffered the same fate, the Nawab's leading general, Mir Madan Khan, made a fatal miscalculation. Thinking that the British were now vulnerable, he ordered his cavalry to charge the British position. This was the moment the British had been waiting for. As Mir Madan's cavalry thundered across the wet ground, the British gunners uncovered their dry cannons. They loaded with grape shot, and their guns roared to life, tearing horrific gaps in the ranks of the charging horsemen. As the survivors reeled back in confusion, Mir Madan himself was struck by a cannonball and mortally wounded. The sight of their brave and loyal commander falling from his horse shattered the morale of the troops he was leading. When the dying general was carried to Siraj's tent, the young Nawab fell into a panic. His most trusted commander was gone, his best troops were in disarray, and his gunpowder was ruined. In this moment of crisis, he lost his nerve. He desperately sought advice and turned to the one man he felt could save him, Mir Jafar. This was the moment the traitor had been waiting for. Following Mir Jafar's treacherous advice, Siraj-ud-Dawla gave the disastrous order to retreat. Signals were sent across the battlefield, and the Nawab's vast army began a slow, disorganized withdrawal. From his vantage point in the mango grove, Robert Clive saw the Nawab's forces beginning to pull back. Initially, he was cautious, but some of his more aggressive junior officers saw the opportunity immediately. Without waiting for direct orders from Clive, a small detachment under Major Eyre Coote advanced from the grove and began to attack the now exposed position that the French artillery contingent had occupied earlier. The massive wing of the army commanded by the traitor Mir Jafar was now beginning to peel away from the main body, moving slowly towards the British lines. This was the prearranged signal. With this confirmation, Clive abandoned his defensive posture and ordered a general advance. The entire British force marched out of the mango grove and towards the Nawab's main encampment. The British advance was swift and relentless. The soldiers loyal to Siraj-ud-Dawla, now leaderless and demoralized, saw their comrades under Mir Jafar abandoning the field. Panic set in. The retreat turned into a rout. Seeing his army disintegrate before his eyes, Siraj-ud-Dawla finally understood the depth of the betrayal. His cause was lost. Mounting a fast camel, he fled the battlefield, making for his capital, Murshidabad. The British soldiers, sensing total victory, stormed the Nawab's camp. They met little organized opposition. The Battle of Plassey was effectively over by 5 o'clock in the evening. The casualties tell the story of the battle's lopsided nature. The Nawab's army suffered around 500 killed and many more wounded. The British had fewer than 25 men killed and around 50 wounded. Clive summoned Mir Jafar, the traitor, to his camp the next day. In a carefully staged ceremony, Clive formally recognized him as the new Nawab of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa. Siraj-ud-Dawla's flight ended a few days later when he was captured, brought back to Murshidabad and swiftly executed on the orders of Mir Jafar's son. The immediate consequence of the Battle of Plassey was a massive transfer of wealth. The new Nawab, Mir Jafar, was forced to pay an enormous sum to the East India Company as compensation and reward. The battle transformed the East India Company from a mere trading entity into a powerful political and military force. For India, Plassey marked the beginning of a long and painful period of colonization. With a puppet Nawab on the throne, the British were able to extract concessions that gave them complete monopoly over the region's economy. They bled Bengal dry, leading to a devastating famine a few years later. The victory at Plassey laid the foundation for nearly 200 years of British rule in India. It was the first major territorial acquisition by the company, the first stepping stone in the creation of the British Raj. In conclusion, the Battle of Plassey stands as one of the most pivotal moments in both Indian and British history. On the surface, it was a small military engagement decided as much by rain and treachery as by gunfire. But its consequences were monumental. It transformed a company of merchants into an empire of rulers. For Siraj-ud-Dowlah, it was the tragic end of his reign and his life. For Robert Clive, it brought fame and immense fortune. For India, it was the beginning of the end of its independence and the dawn of colonial rule that would only be lifted 2 centuries later.
Like this video if you found it informative. Comment your thoughts on this pivotal moment in history. Subscribe for more detailed historical documentaries. Share to spread historical knowledge.